Um, Now, how do you actually study bird evolution? How would you actually go about it to see if these statements are right or wrong? Well, of course, you have to deal with archaeology, so you have archaeological records. But because these are birds, they also have eggs. So you can look at the eggs. You certainly can look at the body size. You can look at the architecture of the wing to see if the wing can sustain actually all the weight. A big issue is actually genetics, DNA, because A, it preserves pretty well, but B, we've also studied bird genetics pretty well, so we have a good knowledge about it. And you can compare the evolution of DNA pretty well, so that's an interesting angle. You also can look into behavior questions of existing birds now, specifically nest behavior is pretty interesting to understand the evolution of the birds and how they evolved. You can look into the song and the singing capabilities, and it's not clear if the Archaeopteryx could sing. Apparently, I think the Archaeopteryx was not a good singer, at least, if at all. And then you can also look at other interesting hints indirectly, such as the tectonics of plates, or look at the food chain development, or seed dispersal, or predators on diseases and so on that interacted with these type of species. So anyway, bird evolution actually is a very big subject. There are many ways to study the phylogeny of the birds. The relevance of feathers is a very central question in evolution of birds, because birds cannot be separated from feathers. So feathers have evolved with these birds, and they certainly are very relevant to clarify the evolution of flight. But it also helps to clarify the evolution of body temperature and the maintenance of body temperature, because the feathers are insulating. So that's the other thing there. So the thing now is that people always have argued that the Archaeopteryx is the oldest bird. That has been at least a long paradigm, at least when I grew up, that was very widely promoted in Europe. Nowadays, it's clear though that these feathered dinosaurs are much older than the Archaeopteryx, and that the other specimens are also older than the Archaeopteryx. So therefore, the Archaeopteryx is not the only evidence along this line. There probably is one lineage out of others. Which raises the question, how again did the feathers evolve? What was the chemistry of the feathers? What pigments were in the feathers? When did they evolve, and what for, if not only flying? And again, what was the purpose? And swimming is a very interesting notion in this question, and we will talk about it later. But swimming, actually, some birds use their wings and the feathers for swimming. So that's actually another angle how feathers could have evolved. When you look at the type of feathers, they're very sophisticated in some birds. Here on the upper right side, you see a bird of paradise. The orange bird, upper right side. The bird of paradise lives in Indonesia and in Papua New Guinea, very famous specimens. There are like a couple of species around, I think 5 or 6, no, up to 11 species birds of paradise. Anyway, they're very, very spectacular because of the feathers. Anyway, not all birds have such spectacular feathers, so here you see certain stages of feathers. They're very primitive feathers, and then they can be again more sophisticated with a vein and with barbels and so on. So depending on where the bird is in the evolution of feathers, you can classify this bird according to this structure of the feathers. Now, there have been other birds that are very old as well, including penguins. And now the penguins, obviously, they can't fly. That raises some interesting question about feathers, because if they have feathers and if they can fly, they probably, and if they're very old, then these feathers probably were there before flying. In other words, perhaps they evolved for insulation. Now, if you're a bird who lives in the ocean, you want to insulate yourself against temperature. However, you don't want to have high buoyancy, because then you can dive deep. Some of these feathers, some of these penguins can dive up to 200 meters, let's say. So therefore, probably that puts an interesting spin on the evolution of feathers, because perhaps they really evolved in the water and not in Archaeopteryx. And therefore, this idea of trees or of gliding down a tree is just really a secondary evolution. If you want to test that out, you can look at the feather chemistry, the pigments, because feathers that are in the tropical ocean and that are in the ocean in general have a very different structure and different pigments. So by just looking at the pigments and the pigment structure in the feathers, it probably helps you to understand the evolution of feathers. So anyway, that's an interesting spin at things. You probably also know that some of these giant penguins are extinct by now, and they lived on New Zealand. Most penguins live in the southern hemisphere, like almost all except for one in Galapagos, that are in the Antarctica area. So that's a classic example there. And again, that giant penguin is extinct. So where will the future of bird evolution go? Likely it will deal more with climate change questions, because the recent change of climate is obviously one of the hotbeds of discussions, but climates have changed in the history of the Earth many times. So there have been many fluctuations in the climate change. Nowadays it's man-made, but in earlier times it has been natural climate fluctuation. So that affected birds for sure, and that affected feathers because of temperature and body temperature maintenance questions. It can also address many new questions that are relevant for an understanding of evolution in the biology of birds. Also putting feather evolution into the order, into the context of habitat and of phylogenetic questions are pretty relevant. And then the future of bird evolution will probably also deal with the missing links. And again, China is one of the examples. There are probably other examples coming up the more people do archaeology. So the missing links are pretty interesting to study and to consider there. And finally, we understand better how evolution contributed to the survival of birds and the conservation of birds. So anyway, I think bird evolution could be an interesting subject in the future. Many people study bird evolution, of course, but if you put it more in an applied context, this will be very exciting. I also like to mention that the feathers are also protecting, obviously, the bird from the outside impacts, specifically contamination and air pollution. And so birds that will be exposed to acid rain, for instance, will have a very different feather structure than birds that are have been protected from it. So anyway, there are many of these type of questions in the modern world we live in, where you have urbanization and contamination of air that affect the feather structure. So that's an interesting question about bird evolution and how birds deal with these changes. I think one of my last slides here shows the classic question, what's wrong with this picture? That is a T-Rex, as you know, very fearful animal, a very scary animal, very big, very powerful. And many movies have been done about it and so on. Now, there's something wrong, and perhaps you guess what is missing here. Let's look at the next feather. Sorry, the next slide here. That's probably how the T-Rex really looked like. So in other words, it actually is a big chicken, which most people and people who make movies about them don't like to admit. But when you go back to the first slide where you see this very cruel, brutal animal, and then compare that to the next slide with the dino fuzz, the feathers, that's obviously a very different animal, and that's not so selling so well. The marketing product of a big chicken is probably much lower than the brutal T-Rex. So anyway, these feathers have been called dino fuzz because that's something in a specimen that's hard to preserve for thousands of years, and so people just have never found the feathers really. But if you would look into this harder, you probably see it, and now people admit it pretty openly that there are feathers on these dinosaurs, certainly on T-Rex, and that might be one of these theories how the T-Rex could look like. You also will see there's not much color in it, it's mostly black and white. But that's what these colors, that's how these birds look like, or these dinosaurs, sorry. So with that, I'm at the end of the lecture. These were the 5 things I wanted to show you. Bird-like dinosaurs, evolution as a principle, how to study bird evolution, the relevance of evolution of feathers, and the future of bird evolution. We will touch more on bird evolution later when it comes to island biogeography and the beak shapes and so on, but here just a basic concept. This lecture also links up with a guest lecture we get from Patrick Duckenmüller from the museum, who works on dinosaurs. So he will put an interesting spin on things that I've said, and he will extend it much better than I can do. Okay, with that, we're done with that lecture. Thank you so much for your attention, and see you next time. Thank you.